maturity or your own success in your professional life. If you could just go through that.
Well, Mrs. Jackson was a very unusual woman in many respects. As you know, she overcame a physical handicap, and that did not in any way prevent her from making public appearances, speeches, and things of that sort. She had a brilliant mind and was also an outstanding businesswoman. I first had close contact with her after I graduated from college and was working as a newspaper reporter at the Afro-American. The thing that she contributed to my life, as she did to many other young people of that time, was a feeling of self-esteem. She was always lavish with praise about things that you did, and always tried to set standards which were, in my judgment, very high. I got a great deal of morale building from her, and I would say that I think I was not alone in that respect. You may remember we had an organization called the Citywide Young People's Forum, and she would back that with her credit in the way of getting advertisements, speakers, fees, and things of that sort. It met every Friday night at Bethel Church. We didn't have much money. We got along on plate collections. But at the end of the year, there would be staged a big event which was used for fundraising, and from that we would reimburse her for her expenditures. It turned out, of course, in those days, $2,000 or $3,000 was a lot of money. That was in the period of the Depression, and very often she would have advanced that much in order to keep the operation going.
Some highlights, of this activity. You have given us more or less general, picture of her activities with the Citywide Youth Forum, on your what you got from her as far as self-esteem, what she bestowed, on you.
Well, her way of doing it would be, if you made a speech, she would say it was great. Or if you engaged in any kind of constructive activity, she always knew about it and would say so. And it was reciprocal in many ways, because as a newspaper reporter, I covered many of her activities, and I admired the way she went about them. For example, in a period when people thought you were being prohibitionists, if you said you didn't want a tavern next door to a church or a school, it was quite unpopular to go down to the zoning board and oppose those things. But she did, nevertheless, and it turns out now that many civic groups and people in the communities all over the country oppose things like that because they are non-conforming zoning uses and are considered detrimental to residential property, schools, and churches. She was way out in front in that respect. She also was a person who would accept the challenge of anybody who was discriminating. That went to the governor, the police commissioner, the mayor, or whoever it was that she thought discriminated. And I must say, discriminators were very numerous in those days. I guess many of them have gone undercover now, but in any event, in those days they were openly discriminated. And nevertheless, she would take them on. As I said, I frequently covered those meetings as a newspaper reporter, but I must admit that I was not entirely objective. I sometimes had the participatory impulse mingled with my reportorial duties.
Some other events. Let me see. How else did she get along with the with the public officials, she fought against discrimination here in the city.
In the beginning, she was an antagonist of many of the public officials because they weren't doing the right thing. However, as time went on and she demonstrated by successful action in court and otherwise that she was right, there began to be built up a tremendous amount of respect for her, and that continued through the years. It included just about any public official who was worth anything. I still see among many of them the residue of her activity and the esteem that they had for her. I guess that the governor of the state who came to her funeral summed it up when he said with some real affection in his voice, of course nobody could ever satisfy Mrs. Jackson, and in a sense that was true. She was a perfectionist who did not want part compliance. She always wanted and usually got total compliance.
Which governor was that?
That had to be Governor Marvin Mandel.
Mandel, right.
Yes. But all of the governors, for example, there was Governor Tawes who had great respect for her, and every governor, I would say, from the time of Albert Ritchie forward. Ritchie was a somewhat unreconstructed Maryland governor and did not have much of a relationship with any black people, but he was followed by Governor Harry Nice, a Republican. Governor Nice had the highest respect for her, and from Nice forward to the governor who was in office at the time she died, which of course was Governor Mandel, they had the highest respect for her.
Now, just going back to the period of, the early period of the civil rights movement, when you went away to, you went away to St. Paul, you came back and you were in Washington.
Yeah.
And these are all the activities, this was a period when you were just getting involved there. Was she in any way able to provide any specific help to the family or, as such?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean, but I would say that I was not just getting involved at that period. I was involved from the time I finished college forward. But I would say that with respect to our relationship, it was always one of cooperation. Yeah. And we had very close family relationships. As a matter of fact, they still exist for those members of the family who are living and those who have become attached to the family through marriage.
Good. Let's move on then to Adam Clayton Powell Jr.
Yes.
Who, most colorful person.
Yes. And
I'd love, for us to spend as much time as possible on Adam, because, to give him as much credit as possible, and, but first of all, your overall view of Adam.
Well, my overall view of Adam was favorable. I thought he was a courageous person, one who could inspire people to do things, a tremendous speaker. It was interesting how we were very close, and he never made any bones about telling how I was doing various things that he was getting credit for. For example, I had initiated an effort to get a bipartisan group of House members together, and we succeeded in getting some Democrats and some Republicans, with Adam serving as the convener. But he very quickly admitted to everybody it wasn't his idea, it was mine. Then in the matter of anti-discrimination amendments that we offered to various bills, education bills, armed services, the matter of National Guard, he always had me write the language, and after we got them going, he would tell people that I was the author. He gave me full run of his office. I'm pleased to say I never took advantage of it. I wouldn't even hang my coat up there without his permission. Well, more without the permission of Miss Louise Dargan, who was his secretary.
She looks good.
She's living in Florida now, and she was a very fine person. My wife, Elizabeth, had known her when Mrs. Dargan was up at the Powell Church in Harlem as a young person in Adam's father's youth group, and we hit it off very well. But as you might know, Adam was so open in his way of doing things that many people would take advantage of him and make use of his office almost as if it were their own. But I never did that, I'm pleased to say. I always had the highest respect for him and for Mrs. Dargan, who was, she's really Miss Dargan. Her married name is Fleming, but we kept calling her by her professional name. And I must say she was a most faithful and constructive staff person, as you might know. There are always people trying to worm their way into situations like that and find out something that would be destructive to a member of Congress, but she was intensely loyal, and he raised her to the position of clerk of the House Education and Labor Committee when he became chairman, which is, of course, the highest staff position, and that is the person who hires and discharges, executes programs and things of that sort. So she was rewarded by him, but she would have been loyal anyway, in my judgment. Also, she was very capable and still is a capable person, though retired now.
Just now, moving back to specific procedures that was involved in some of those early anti-discrimination bills.
Yes.
This was all a prelude to 1957.
Yes.
About when did you start?
I started, I think, in 1946. The technique was to offer an amendment which would say that you cannot use these monies if you discriminate. And there were numerous programs that were designed to receive federal help. For example, there was a Defense Impacted Area program which was designed to give aid to schools in areas where you had a large number of defense workers and military people, children of them working, because that cut down on the tax advantage, and the federal government therefore called itself supplementing that loss. We tried to get an amendment to that effect. We had the whole question then, the universal military training came up, and we actually did get an amendment on, which irritated President Eisenhower very much. And then, of course, we were trying to get past a federal regulation prohibiting discrimination in interstate travel. It was clear to us that under the Constitution, the discrimination was unconstitutional, but we felt that it could be supplemented by legislation, and did try to get such a bill through. I must say that while we didn't succeed in Adams' day on some of those things, we did eventually succeed. We also tried to get fair employment practice legislation passed. We did not get it in his time as a matter of legislation, although we got executive orders which covered the same ground. But as you know, we finally succeeded in '64 when we got the Title VII of the 1964 Act passed, which established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Then Title VI of the 1964 Act really carries out the objectives that we had in prohibiting by amendments that what we sought, the expenditure of government funds in a non-discriminatory way. As you know, the Title VI prohibits such expenditure. So the groundwork was laid, and the task of trying to bring it into reality was difficult, but I'm pleased to have lived long enough to see it has come into effect and is now the law.
Powell was a very colorful person at times. His ego would seem to to get in his own way. How did you find him personally? Is he that type of activity? I think in later years you did have some differences with him.
I may have at times disagreed with him on something, but never on anything that was really fundamental. And while he had a reputation of being vain in some cases and that kind of thing, I found that was greatly exaggerated so far as he was concerned. In his relationship with me, he was always respectful. We might once in a while exchange some humorous remark, but he was always respectful and communicated that respect to other people. Now, one of the things I think that was against him was the fact that he believed he was as good as any other member of Congress and entitled to all the rights, privileges that a member of Congress should have. There were a lot of members who didn't like that. They thought, being unreconstructed Southerners, for example, that he shouldn't use the barber shop, he shouldn't use the gymnasium, and he shouldn't challenge people when they crossed him up. But he was a real man who believed that after the people of New York elected him to office, he ought to act like a congressman. The result was that he made some enemies in that respect. But interestingly, even some of his enemies finally conceded that he was a superior person and almost seemed to regret some of the things they had done to hurt him.
The steps leading up to the 57th Civil Rights Act. Could you just go through that? I know there was the FEPC, which was the struggle for the equal employment opportunity, and the FEPC. There's also the matter of the poll tax, which is also another key feature. If you could just describe how that came about and some of the politics that was involved.
Well, so far as the 1957 Act is concerned, it came about in this fashion. President Truman had appointed a committee which issued a report called To Preserve These Rights. In that report, it was indicated that there are certain things which should be done in order to eliminate or reduce racial discrimination in the United States. One of them was that there ought to be a voting statute which would make it a civil penalty rather than a criminal penalty to deny people the right to vote, because experience had shown that the criminal part of it was not enforced. It also provided that there ought to be a Civil Rights Commission which would monitor the discriminatory things that were happening in the United States and provide the President and Congress with an official documentation of these things. It also said in the report that there ought to be protection against job discrimination, and that there ought to be in the Department of Justice an Assistant Attorney General whose job it would be to protect civil rights. At the time the report was written, there was just a small section of the criminal division in the Department of Justice which was designed to protect civil rights. After the committee issued that report, it was more or less put on the back burner, but I felt that we ought to try to get it enacted into law, the provisions. And so when the time came where we could hope to accomplish that, I did ask some members of Congress if they would introduce that bill. Some of them did, and the major provisions.
No, I just want to ask, who were some of those members?
I'd have to look it up, but to my best recollection, one of them was Congressman Keating, who was the very fine Republican from up in New York, Emanuel Seller, who was chairman of the Democrat from New York, chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and a number of others. I would not want to leave anybody out, but anyway, they were people in the House and Senate. We did not get very far the first time it was introduced. We had extensive...
Which is 56?
That is correct. Well, it actually came to hearings in 1956.
Yeah.
And then when we got to the end of the session, I thought it would be very advisable if we could have the Republicans, who were the main people giving us trouble on getting it passed, declare that it ought to be part of their platform. And I spoke to Senator Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania, who was then the, to my best recollection, chairman or close to being chairman of the Republican National Committee. In any event, he undertook to get it made a part of the Republican platform, and it was declared to be a part of the platform. We ran into a difficult parliamentary situation in the Senate. We had succeeded in getting the bill passed in the House, and then we were trying to get it considered in the Senate. We were trying to use what is called Senate Rule 14, and that is a rule which enables the Senate to take bills for consideration that have passed the House without referring them to the appropriate committee. I wanted to do that because Senator Eastland of Mississippi was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and obviously if we referred the bill to him, it would die. This precipitated a very awful parliamentary fight on the floor, in which members were denouncing each other, and it was as near chaos as you could get on the floor of the United States Senate. So I sent in a note for Senator Clifford Case of New Jersey to come out because I wanted to talk with him. When he came out, he and I were old friends from the time when he was in the House of Representatives. Incidentally, he was one of those who had introduced the bill in the House when he was in the House, but subsequently went to the Senate. I asked him if he would engage in a colloquy with the majority leader and the minority leader. That was Senator Lyndon Johnson of Texas and Senator William Nolan of California, and asked them whether they would agree that the Civil Rights Bill would be one of the first things to be taken up on the floor of the Senate in the new Congress. Both of them, in response to his question, said yes, they would take it up, and they would take it up early. I, on the basis of that, made a prediction which was carried in the Congressional Quarterly that I was sure the legislation would be taken up in the Senate at an early time, and I'm pleased to say it was taken up, and after a lot of travail, it was passed, those parts which had been recommended by President Truman's committee. One part which failed was a part that was very valuable but had been offered by Attorney General Brownell in the Eisenhower administration. That's known as Part 3. That came about when I went to talk with Mr. Brownell about the executive branch recommending the legislation. He agreed to do it, and in addition, of course, added this part which was very valuable but which was lost in the fighting to get the bill passed. Nevertheless, what did get passed was the provision which made it a civil matter to deny people the right to vote. The Assistant Attorney General in charge of a full civil rights division, which still exists, was set up. And in addition, there was established the Civil Rights Commission.
Let me just double check, please.
Well, I got
my
Attorney General in charge of a full civil rights division, which still exists, was set up. And in addition, there was established the Civil Rights Commission.
Now, the Rule 14 you mentioned is what is known as Wednesday. It was introduced at a special time during the week of Wednesday, or
calendar Wednesday is a House bill. Rule 14 that I'm speaking of is a rule in the Senate which says that a bill which passes the House may be held at the Vice President's desk if a member objects, or two members on the second time around object to having it referred to a committee. This means that because the bill is at the desk, if the leadership consents, it can be called up any time, and that gives a great advantage in the case where you've got a committee that doesn't want to let legislation out. Well, that rule is still in effect, and as a matter of fact, the voting rights legislation, which is pending in the Senate after passage in the House, that House bill is at the Vice President's desk, and can be called up if Tom Thurmond delays things. But there is also another device which we had a big fight about because some members of the Senate didn't like the idea of invoking Rule 14, but there's another device under which the Senate can order a committee to report out a bill, and indeed that device was used in the 1960 law, which explain if you care to have me do so.
Yes, please.
Well, in the invocation of Rule 14, my good personal friend Senator Wayne Morris of Oregon objected strenuously to using Rule 14. He said that he felt this was really a weakening of the Senate procedures, and he inveighed against it, denounced most of us for trying to use that process, but it was successful, and we got the bill passed. We then, the next time around, said, well, Senator Morris, you had strong feelings about this. What will you do to help us get the Senate to order the Judiciary Committee to report the bill out? And I'm pleased to say he did work with us, other senators did, and we succeeded in getting an order passed requiring that the Senate Judiciary Committee report the 1960 Civil Rights Bill to floor, and it was subsequently passed.
At this point, if we could just go into the rules of some of the key senators. You have now touched on Senator Morris, who was a very colorful person.
Yes, and a wonderful, brilliant man.
How well did you get along with Senator Morris?
Well, Senator Morris and I got along beautifully. As a matter of fact, right after the big fight, I went down to his office and he said, you know, you're welcome in my office anytime. And he was always that way. I understood his views, although I didn't agree with some of them, but he had a long record of civil rights support. For example, when we were at war, he was a member of what was called the War Labor Board, and on that he was prepared to do battle by denying wage increases to those groups that discriminated on the basis of race, which was almost unheard of in those days. And then when he became a member of the Senate, he waged a last-ditch fight to try to save the Wartime Fair Employment Practice Committee. As a matter of fact, on the floor of the Senate, the night that final votes were being taken, a compromise had been reached under which it was said that the committee would receive a certain amount of money with which to close out its business. And Senator Barkley got up on the floor and said to Senator Morris, well, I don't know why you don't think this is acceptable, because the officials who are running the FEPC have accepted it. And Morris said, I don't care who has accepted it. It is a fact of life that this committee is being discriminated against, and I don't accept this compromise. Then when we had a fight against the nomination of Senator Eastland to be chairman of the Judiciary Committee. He and Senator Lehman of New York were about the only two who really made an all-out effort to support us in trying to block Eastland's getting the chairmanship of the Judiciary Committee. So he was a tremendous force for good, but he was also a stickler on procedures, and felt that the invocation of Rule 14 was not the way to do business.
Morse is, should I say, very angry, or he didn't like the final product, the 57 Act, as it came in, because he felt it was too weak. But people like you and I guess Rao and others felt that, well, that was, it was a start, a beginning.
Well, actually, the lesson I learned in the Congress of the United States was that you get what you've got the votes to pass. And on counting the votes, we could see that this was what we could get. What was especially important about that legislation was the fact that you were breaking through the barrier which had prevented effective action against voting discrimination. You see, up until the time that law was passed, organizations like the NAACP had to carry the whole burden of civil action to protect the right to vote. But when that law was passed, it required the government of the United States to get in there and act, which turned out to be tremendously effective. Also, there was always a hassle about whether we were exaggerating conditions of discrimination in the country. But when we had the Civil Rights Commission, a government body which was really the servant of Congress and the President, vested with the power to uncover the facts, then you really had something very worthwhile. Also, when you lifted the function of the Department of Justice out from this little one-room category on civil rights where they had a section to a whole division, that also was a tremendous step forward. Now, interestingly, it was not just Senator Morse who had raised the question about the bill's adequacy, but Mr. Nixon, who was his vice president, also raised the question about it. Indeed, he asked me if we would desist on trying to get it approved because, as he put it, there's an election coming up, and you've got some very good people running for office. He mentioned Walter Kohler, for example, up in Wisconsin, and we'll get a better bill when they come in. Well, Mr. Kohler was not elected, and he didn't get better people, but we did accomplish the most important thing, and that is we pointed out that the myth of saying you can not pass any civil rights legislation unless you change the Senate Rule 22 limiting debate was really a myth, because we had an all-night filibuster against that bill, staged by Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, and in spite of that, we were able to win.
Was it Thurmond alone, or was
he was alone? Senator Russell and others had filibustered, but it was Thurmond who, after everybody had agreed to the passage of the bill, Thurmond took the floor and staged an all-night filibuster to try to block it. And there were times when he and I and his wife were the only people, the presiding officer were the only people that had a great Senate chamber, but nevertheless, he didn't win. And it was important to demonstrate that you could get legislation passed if you had the votes, because as it was, people were saying a whole lot of reasons why you couldn't pass legislation. Some would say that, well, if you wait until summer to pass a bill, you'll get bogged down with appropriations and you can't pass a civil rights bill. Others would say that if you try to break a filibuster, there's no way to do it because the filibusters are too strong. Both of those myths were exploded. So we did have the advantage of substantive legislation, which was good, and also we exploded those myths. And from that point on, we went up in the matter of getting legislation passed.
The rule of Lyndon Johnson at that time was very interesting.
Well, at that time, he cooperated because, as I said, we had earlier gotten a commitment from him on the floor of the Senate when I asked Senator Case to engage in the colloquy with him and Senator Nolan. You remember I said that we got a commitment from him that would be a thing that acts on very early in the session, and he kept his word. Now, his problem was that he felt that we should have a jury trial amendment on the bill, and also he was not in favor of Mr. Brownell's Part 3. I'm certain that if we had full support from him on Part 3, we could have won.
That's where the central differences were.
Those two items were the central differences. But throughout, we maintained face-to-face communication, and I must say that there were times when I might have used some strong language in pressing my point, but we never really got to the place where we couldn't talk to each other. And years later, he said in one of his last speeches he ever made was that he didn't know whether he had come closer to me or I to him, but in any event, we were together and we're good friends, which is true.
You have a copy of that speech. Where is it?
I don't know where the copy is, but I have one.
I know you I'll have to dig it up because I really want to see that.
Well, he made references twice.
That's
Once when we presented him with a embossed certificate of the first vote that was the first person to register after the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And then subsequently, when we went down to the dedication of the Johnson Library in Texas, I don't mean to boast, but since it is an accuracy, I would say that I was the one who made the suggestion of having this voting certificate presented to them. There were a group of blacks in government who got together. I was not in government myself, with the NAACP, but they were trying to find out what would be a good gift for him as he was leaving the presidency. So I suggested that we get the first certificate of a person to register in Selma, Alabama, and have that embossed in metal, and it turned out that the Nicholas Katzenbach, who was the Attorney General at that time, cooperated with us, and we found that certificate, which was a lady who was a nurse who had, I think, 3 or 4 sons who were in the service, a highly intelligent person. It was really a kind of a dream person to have on a certificate. And there I made a very serious error by not paying attention to my wife. We were trying to get the affair started, and we had hotel reservations, that kind of thing. But of course, as you know, when you have things of that kind, you've got to have various kinds of clearances on people. And it seemed to me that might cause a delay if we tried to get a clearance for this lady, and then the question of transporting her to Washington and so forth. My wife said, I don't care what it is, you ought to get that lady up here because she would make a wonderful presentation and it would be a marvelous public relations thing. Well, foolishly, I didn't press it, and we didn't get her up. Then I have never forgotten the awful feeling of disappointment I had when it turned out who she was, and Jet Magazine carried a wonderful story about her, which I still have.
Oh, where would that be? I mean, papers?
Somewhere.
Okay.
I've got it, but as you know, I've got to go through all that.
You're right.
Simeon Booker can tell you. In fact, he sent it to me recently. I asked for a reproduction of it to use if I testified on the voting rights legislation, and he sent me a reproduction of it. So I may have it in a more convenient place in all those boxes.
In those early years, when Lyndon Johnson was not truly a recognized convert, what were your impressions of it?
Well, it was practical, political impressions. We met, and he said, I am in favor of the Supreme Court decision on school desegregation. I'll back it to the hilt. He said, I'm in favor of executive orders. I want any kind of executive order that the president can get to end discrimination. But he said, I'm not in favor of acting on legislation because if we act on legislation, we'll divide the South from the North in the Democratic Party, and this means we will not be able to get social legislation. I think social legislation is important for both blacks and whites. In other words, his reason for not wanting legislation was because it would divide the Democratic Party, not because he was against it. And there's where we would have our arguments, because I contended that it was possible to get both and still hold the party together. And he then made his famous statement to me at 5 o'clock in the morning in his office after we'd been up all night on a filibuster. Clarence, you can get anything you want if you've got the votes. How many votes have you got?
You've never forgotten that.
I've never forgotten it, and that picture there is what I reminded him of it again when I said, all right, Mr. President, we've got our share of votes.
Which now, these are, now
this is a picture of President Johnson, Joseph Rao, and myself.
Right.
At the time when we were getting ready for the fight in the United States Senate for the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Bill.
Now this was right after Kennedy was killed, and
that is correct.
Right, because Joe referred to that.
That piece of paper laying on the desk there is one which has a list of about 8 or 9 senators that we said, Mr. President, you've got to get these, and here's what we have. And he smiled and said, all right, I'll get them, and he did.
Paul Douglas at that time was also another great civil rights, great liberal senator.
That is correct.
Very helpful. What are your recollections of Paul?
Paul was a wonderful person who had great commitment on civil rights because he was also brilliant, having been a former college professor and a veteran of World War II. He served in the Marine Corps. You know, he went in as a private and came out as a colonel, but with a very serious injury that impaired the use of one of his arms. But he was a person you could always depend on to carry the fight. But he was not always able to get as many people to follow him as Hubert Humphrey could. Indeed, that was one of Johnson's arguments, that we ought to use Humphrey as the leader in the Senate because he could get people to follow him, and Johnson would support Humphrey.
This is 57 now.
No, this is now. I'm speaking of I guess that would be 60 or so. Yes, because Douglas continued throughout.
This is now after this 57 Act was passed, and you move on to 60 now.
Well, yes, you see, 60 was a measure which was really supplementary to the 57 Act. We found, after we got the 57 Act passed, that the registrars would destroy the records, so you couldn't prove they discriminated. So we had to pass a law making it mandatory that they preserve the records. Then we also established in that legislation what we called referees, who would be officers of federal courts carrying out the responsibility of seeing that people were permitted to vote if they were denied the right to vote because of race.
I'm just going to jump along to another point, which is somewhat tied into this.
I forgot to mention, too, we also had in that bill a very important provision dealing with making it a federal offense to bomb or dynamite a place of worship, because we'd had a whole terrible series of such things. And interestingly, the question was, how can the federal government get jurisdiction? And we established by that legislation a presumption that if dynamite were used, that the presumption would be that it had moved in interstate commerce, and that therefore gave the federal government jurisdiction under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution.
Just jumping back to Johnson, were you really that close with him then, or how would you have described your relationships?
Well, we were very close. Well, I'll tell you how it came about. Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri was a person that I was very close to. We had been friends when he was president of the Emerson Electric Company out in St. Louis, Missouri, and a very helpful person. Also, he had Maryland ties, family ties, which somehow got us together. So I asked him to introduce me to Mr. Johnson. It so happened my brother-in-law, Carl Downs, who was president of college down in Texas, knew him very well, and other people knew him. He had a reputation of being liberal by Texas standards, as indeed he was. But I got to meet him on that basis through Senator Symington, and I found that it was very easy to see him and talk with him whenever I wanted to. Indeed, he was the kind of person who, if you were in a gallery and he felt he had to tell you something, would call you down to discuss something with you, as he did with me. As I said, one morning, 5 o'clock, he was, to my best recollection, in his underwear, and he had been up all night as I had, trying to get a little relaxation. So he and I think George Reedy was there, although I'm not sure. And at that time we were discussing the legislation. But the statement that he made about his support for executive orders and court decisions was made very early in our acquaintance. So I never had any doubt about his commitment to civil rights per se.
Yeah, you never had very much doubt about
his commitment to civil rights per se. But our difference was whether you could achieve this by legislation. And he felt that social legislation was more important than civil rights legislation because it benefited both blacks and whites and raised the economic level of the poor people. That was his big position, which from his standpoint made sense. He was essentially a New Dealer. He was a great admirer of President Roosevelt.
I'm just going to jump back again. Your political look at your political development as you went along. How would you describe that process? How did you come really to become involved? I know back here in Maryland you started you ran as for the state senate.
No, I ran for the House.
For the House, right? And you've always had that those feelings. But in Washington, or rather, I should say, really as a lobbyist, who are some of the how did you really come to be so well equipped with the skills for lobbying?
Well, I don't know whether I could say I was well equipped. I like to think I knew what I was doing, and I felt that the best way to handle that responsibility was to apply fairness and common sense, to treat people the way I would like to be treated, to praise them if they did what was right and condemn them if they did what I thought was wrong, but never to threaten them in a way which would mean you couldn't carry out the threat. There were some people who would go in there and say, we're going to get back and defeat you if you don't vote with us. I never said that because I would feel that if there was any way of defeating them, I could do that without letting them know. And if there wasn't any way of defeating them, they'd know it better than I would. So that threat wouldn't impress them. I did feel also a great loyalty to those who supported us, so that in some places I was known as a Democrat, and other places I was known as a Republican because I had been in trying to help get people who had helped us reelected. For example, it was Senator Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts. I went up to Massachusetts at the time when Jack Kennedy was running against him and did all I could to help him. So people promptly thought I was a Republican. But then later I went down to Rhode Island. My recollection is that Senator Pastore was running, although I can't be entirely sure. But whoever was running was a Democrat and had been friendly, and I spoke favorably for that person. There was a bipartisan team of blacks following me, calling themselves a kind of a truth squad. And they gave me a clean bill of health. They said I had been fair in supporting people on the basis of the record.
Joe Rao, well, not only Joe, but a number of people have feel that a part of your success as a lobbyist was due to the fact that you were a Republican who could, and as a result, you had access that a lot of others did not have, like himself, I guess, who was a Democrat, have to Republicans, key Republicans. Was that a...
As a matter of fact, I was neither Republican nor Democrat. I was I was a registered independent voter. I did not register as a Democrat until after I retired. And and that was one of the things I always made clear to people with whom I dealt, and I think that did mean a lot to them because I had no hesitancy about supporting a Republican if the Republican had been our friend, or a Democrat. And I could give you a long list of such people, say one who is still living or retired, and that's Hugh Scott in Pennsylvania. I was intensely loyal to Hugh because he was always helpful to us. And the funny thing, I was on collision course with two Kennedys because of that. In the case of Jack, I was on a collision course with him because Cabot Lodge had been our friend. And in the case of Bobby, I was on a collision course with him because Ken Keating had been our friend and he was running against Ken. But that didn't mean I thought any the less of either Jack or Bobby, but it seemed to me my loyalty ought to go to the person who had helped us.
And yet you were able to maintain excellent relations with both Kennedys.
Oh, yes, I had. As a matter of fact, I knew Jack before many people thought he was important. Adam Powell was one who introduced us, and he was just a member of Congress at the time. So
you said that, I don't know whether I read it somewhere, but you said this is someone, Powell said this is...
Yes, he said, you want to keep track of him because I don't remember the exact words, but it was to the effect that he's going to be an important person.
The 48 election in Philadelphia was a watershed in many respects.
Yes.
In that it focused...
convention.
48 convention, yeah, right, in Philadelphia. In that it focused on, it was focused so much on civil rights legislation and on the battles that were upcoming.
That's right.
At that time, you were a labor secretary for the NAACP. 48.
I suppose I was.
Because you became labor secretary 46.
Is that right? Yeah.
Right, 48.
Yeah.
What were your impressions then of that? Those years.
Well, of course, in those days, the effort to put civil rights planks in the platform usually didn't amount to much, and the participation of blacks in the Democratic Convention was not very high, so that it was essentially the kind of thing that you would get if you had the support of liberals and the labor people. I could see then that this was a very valuable alliance, labor and liberal people. By today's standards, the plank in the Democratic platform was not any great roof raiser, but at least it was sufficient to cause the Southerners to walk out.
Again, back to this early period, the FEPC battle was more or less launched by Randolph. Or how would you put it?
That is correct. The war was going on. Blacks were being denied jobs. Mr. Randolph said that he would stage a march on Washington as a protest. And the government became alarmed and tried to decide what they could do to head off that march. The result was the president issued Executive Order 8802.
What are your impressions of Randolph?
Well, I got along with him fine. You see, I had the advantage of knowing him from St. Paul. We had a very ardent...
We went out to St. Paul.
Well, he had organized out there.
Right.
He had a very ardent supporter out there, Mr. William Boyd.
B-O-Y-D.
Frank Boyd, I'm sorry. Frank Boyd, B-O-Y-D. And Mr. Boyd was one of the old-time union members. So I got some kind of relationship with him through that. I think also we probably had him to speak at the forum, although I can't remember. So I had a high regard for him.
Was he an influence in you in that, how you had a high regard for him? Just when you're back in Washington, when you were also very much while with federal government, and then now with the NAACP, you had also taken up the FEPC, and you were carrying it also on your own.
Yes.
How did your efforts then, coincide? In what way? Did you work together actively, or was it more a parallel?
Well, he used to refer to me as the quarterback, and so I think he relied to a great extent on my knowledge of the legislative process. But of course, there were other people working in it too. But I do think they felt that I would not fool him on any legislative matter.
So by then, at that time, then you had also become an acknowledged or recognized lobbyist, apparently. Your knowledge of
Well, I have to leave that to the judgment of other people. I'll say I was there.
You're there, okay. I'll also be speaking with Bob Weaver.
Yes.
Because
Bob was the person who brought me to Washington.
Yeah.
And if you care to have me tell you, I will explain that. I had Bob come to St. Paul when I was up there to speak. My objective was to have as many of the black leaders of the country come to St. Paul as possible. I had Mrs. Bethune, I had Bob, I had then Congressman Arthur Mitchell of Illinois, and a great many other people who were prominent in the black news, and also people for whom I had respect. Bob came and we had him talk. Then he said to somebody, well, the strange thing about me was I had him come there but didn't ask him for a job. Well, I wasn't interested in trying to get a job. I wanted to have him there because I felt he was an important person, and I had known about his work from back east. Well, the net result was, as we got into the period of gearing up for the war, he seemed to think that I could be useful in Washington and asked me if I would come. And I don't recall whether I said yes or no, but I didn't go at that time. And then later I got a telegram asking me to come. It turned out that he had asked for the telegram, but apparently the wording of it was such that they could have said when I got there that I didn't have a job. But in that event, I guess God was with me, because I left the Urban League and went down there and went to work immediately, whereas there are a lot of people who got telegrams like that and found they didn't have a job after they got there.
Your taking over the Washington Bureau was marked by the fact that, or the differences in style between you and your predecessor. You immediately took command of that position because it was clear that you had the prior experience and the knowledge, but also your own style of operation. Now, within the association, there was the change at the top also between Walter White and Roy.
He was my predecessor.
Who's that?
Director of the Washington Bureau.
Between Walter.
Well, you see, at the time I became director, Walter was executive secretary and director of the Washington Bureau. The board had always wanted to have a resident director, but never had one until that period when the job of Washington Bureau Director was separated from the...
what was Perry?
He was an administrative assistant to Walter White.
Oh.
I was the first resident director of the Bureau and the successor of Walter White. I can understand.
Clear, right?
I can understand how you might be confused, because Henry Moon, who was the person who always was very solicitous about Walter's feelings, sort of fudged that one And he said he did it to keep Walter's feelings from being hurt. But Walter's feelings weren't hurt. He was happy to have me take over as director, succeeding him.
Yeah, because it was clear that Perry would stay in the background. He was not doing the meeting, not doing the frontline work on the Hill.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that. I would say that Leslie was an effective operator and very busy at all times. But as I said, he was not the bureau director. He was Walter's administrative assistant.
Where did Roy fit into all of this?
Well, Roy and I, of course, have been friends for many years, and he was the assistant secretary at that time. For the most part, he did not have much contact on Washington matters, but when Walter went to that round-the-world trip, Roy took over, as you know. And then he became very much involved.
Your early relations with Roy, and I'm moving now into a little of internal politics, because this was a time when, how much do you feel like going?
I would rather not get into that because I don't think it serves any useful purpose. I can only say that Roy and our friendship goes back to the time when I was a young newspaper reporter, and also when I was in Minnesota. So I really never had any serious disagreements with him on anything.
Sure. What I was about to ask was...
as a matter of fact, I had a very nice...
As a matter of fact...
maybe I don't want to say this on the record, but I will say it to you. I have a very lovely letter from Mrs. Wilkins in which she said that Roy always had the highest respect for me. And so I'm sure that our regard for each other was mutual.
I've been pushing along.
I began work with the NAACP. The reason I can't understand why we weren't together before that, because he was in government and interested in civil rights, but somehow our paths didn't cross, and until I went with the NAACP. And then we were in frequent contact, so that eventually we became almost inseparable. As an illustration of the continuity of our friendship, he saw an editorial in the Washington Post, I believe it was one day last week, but whenever it was about my handling of the Diggs case, and they had misunderstood what I had said about the possibility of racial discrimination. I had said that in Maryland, I felt because of the state's past history, it fell into the category of suspect areas, which has a legal meaning. I didn't say that Maryland discriminated. And then somebody said, well, are you saying that they discriminated against Mr. Diggs on the basis of race? I said, I'm not saying that, but I'm not ruling it out as a possibility. And the Post misunderstood that and said I made a flimsy charge of racial discrimination, whereupon Joe took it upon himself immediately to answer them, and did, and sent me a copy of his letter that he sent to them, in which I didn't feel like I needed any defense. It didn't matter to me what they were saying. But Joe was very upset about it and sent me a copy of his letter to the Post, which came today. He was incensed that they would try to impugn my motives.
Okay, I'll get a copy.
I can get him on and make a copy.
Okay, so
let me take the top part off, because it was a little personal message over there. I don't want to get him into trouble. Make sure when you give it to us, you give it back.
Okay, so when you started with the NAACP, that's when your paths crossed.
Right. I knew who he was before that, but we didn't have a close personal relationship such as we developed in later years.
Yeah, he was a founder and a vice president of the ADA.
Yes.
Which was, has been called many names.
Oddly enough, though, my relationship with him was more personal. Of course, he was with the ADA, and they were interested in many of the same things we were interested in, but oddly enough, somehow we were just drawn together as people.
Yeah. Well, your interests were very similar.
Exactly. Yes.
Joe figures it was around 1950.
That could be correct, although it might have been earlier. I'm not sure. You know how it is with your friends; you don't always remember when it begins.
Exactly.
Yes.
But in that time, how did you really work together, both of you?
Well, we worked together on legislation, and usually Joe was a master of framing language for bills, and just about everybody relied on him for framing of legislation. So that I guess we became a kind of a team where he would formulate language, and my responsibility was to try to get that language approved by Congress.
Which is just what he said. Well, you said it more. You said he was more or less like the technical expert, and you were the humanist.
Well, whichever way it was, he did the writing, and he loved to write. And he had very wonderful ideas on what ought to be done, and he had been doing that before. He was doing it for the Roosevelt administration while he was in
So then he had all that really discipline and practice before.
Well, not only that, of course, he was one of those brilliant young people who came down to Washington in the days of the New Deal. He was a Harvard man, and some of them, like Bill Hasty and people of that sort, came down from Harvard. So he was one of the junior brain trusters, I guess. Also, he had been a clerk for Supreme Court Justice Cardozo, and one other justice.
Not Frankfurt.
I don't think it was Frankfurt.
He mentioned anywhere I can.
He had contact with Frankfurt, but I don't think he was Frankfurt's clerk. But I know it was Cardozo's clerk.
So then you began working together. How did, until both of you were recognized in gallery as a Goldust twin?
That is right.
But that was later on. But the process of developing this type of relationship with someone who was really, he was a key part for you, he was.
Oh, yes. Because I never trusted my own judgment on whether to accept or oppose a change in legislation until I had checked with him and we had talked it over to find out whether we'd be hurt or helped by it. I trusted his judgment above all others, really.
Now, about the time you met him, the big struggle was the FEPC battle.
I would think, yes, we were in that period. We were trying to get the wartime FEPC made into a permanent agency, and there was a bill which had been introduced. My recollection was that Andy B. Miller was a kind of the point man. He was in Congress at that time.
Right, that is so
I can't remember who was the author of that bill, though. It was a simple piece of legislation, really setting up a wartime agency as the legislative agency. And at that time, we were knocked out by Sam McConnell, who was a congressman from Pennsylvania. Samuel McConnell. He was the congressman from Pennsylvania who offered a substitute which was accepted in the House. And that substitute took away the enforcement powers of EEOC accordingly.
Of FEPC.
I mean, yes, it was FEPC, which we rejected because it lacked enforcement power.
So this was. You see, I'm still trying to get all some of the threads that led up to the 57 Act. The currents.
Well, you see, actually, the FEPC was dropped from the 57
Act, right?
By the various currents in Congress. I think I mentioned to you once before that we had a personality conflict there. Senator Tom Hennings of Missouri was one of our very great friends, but he had an intense dislike for Herbert Brownell, the Attorney General. Neither he nor Mr. Brownell would get together, so I undertook to be the arbiter between them and visited Brownell, suggesting that maybe the best way to get started would be to rely on the Truman Committee's report, which had, as I said, those elements which became a part of the bill. The House, as I remember, was unwilling to include FEPC in it. So it was kind of academic about whether you could.
So that stays then. Okay, now with the Truman's Commission report, FEPC then more or less was pushed to the background.
Well, actually, FEPC had been killed before the
right, because you wrote a long article about that.
Yeah, before the Truman report was issued, and what we did to try to keep the idea alive was to rely on executive orders, which are kind of a complicated process, because in doing so we had to overcome the Russell Amendment that Senator Russell had put in, prohibiting the expenditure of executive funds for any operation that had not been authorized by Congress. But I discovered that there were operations similar to that which was prohibited being carried on by taking the money out of agencies that did have authorized appropriations. And therefore we got our appropriations out of the Civil Service Commission's budget and the Department of Labor's budget. That meant we had set up the equivalent of the EOC, one which would handle government contracts and the other which handled discrimination in government. These were two Truman executive orders.
Oh, that's right. Okay. Now coming back to Joe now, moving along your work, some of the key phases. Now, you're also working with Clayton Powell at this stage, right?
Adam and I worked together up until, I guess, the time we got into the 57 Act. And the reason, 56 became 57, you're right. But the reason we weren't as close on that is he was not on that committee. You see, that was Judiciary Committee, and he was on Labor Committee. Labor had no jurisdiction in it.
So then, with Joe Rao on then who took over then? At that time, it was Emmanuel Sever then who was.
That is correct. He was chairman of the committee.
Right, on the Judiciary. Now, working with
Keating was the ranking Republican member.
Right. Working with Joe now, what are some of the highlights of this, relationship? Leading up to that period, from 50...
Well, I'm not sure I understand what you mean by highlights.
Well, sure, you both worked on legislation.
Right.
And, trying to eradicate, on legislation. You were drafting and you would pass it and offer your judgments there and be the humanist, as he said.
I don't know what he meant for that.
But still, there are some periods, such as that when you're called the Gold Dust Twins while you're up there in the gallery, or you're called the Vultures of the Senate and so forth and so on. But in working with, for example, Eisenhower, how did you, go about that, working with the Eisenhower administration, really, per se, with Brownell and the others? He participated with you then.
That's correct. Right. Well, no, my relationship with him, interestingly, was very personal. I had never met Eisenhower, but Cabot Lodge, the senator who was defeated by Kennedy, was named as the transition chairman when Eisenhower came in. And I asked Cabot Lodge if he would get agreement on a certain number of things. Among them was continuation of the agencies established by Truman's executive order, which he agreed to do. We got those continued. Thereafter, I don't remember now whether he was Saltonstall's assistant or Lodge's assistant, but Maxwell Rabb was over in the White House somehow. They got him in, and he and I had a good first relationship. We continued to work together, and that extended up through to the Eisenhower top people. And as I said, I always tried to be fair in my assessments, so there would be times when I might be commending Eisenhower, as I did when he issued the order abolishing schools on military posts. I was annoyed with him when he was intimidated by Senator Russell, saying that some parts of this bill that can be enforced at the point of a ban. And poor Eisenhower said we need to realize that was in the bill, and I was very annoyed about that. So that my relationship sort of grew in the Eisenhower administration with people who were in the White House family, and also members of the House and Senate who had connections of one kind or another were Republicans. And I guess in those days it was more or less on my own insofar as my relationships with the Republicans were concerned, because of course most of my colleagues in the civil rights effort were Democrats, and many of them didn't have a very high opinion of Eisenhower.
But you stuck with you right throughout. Well, the both of you.
Oh, yeah.
You're right. You did.
As a matter of fact, there was never a time when we weren't acting in concert. As I said, sometimes it probably would not have been good strategy to have him involved in discussions with Republicans, because he was so well known as a Democrat. But eventually we overcame that, and the Republicans and Democrats accepted him too.
And yet both of you as a team had certain obstacles, in that you're black, he was a Jew. He was also a member of the, founder of the ADA, and closely linked with strong liberal causes.
And the Democratic Party. He was a prominent Democrat.
Right. What were your views of the attacks on him then?
Well, to tell you the truth, I don't think he bothered much about the attacks, and half of them I didn't even know about. So we were very troubled by those attacks, much one way or the other.
But he was always called a communist. He was oftentimes called a communist.
I don't know he's ever called a communist, but he defended a lot of people who were charged with having communist ties and that kind of thing, but he was defending them as a lawyer. But I didn't know anybody ever called him personally communist. They might have. I don't know about it, though. Actually, they always thought of him as being radical, because he was an ardent defender of the First Amendment rights of people. And also he would carry a picket sign at the drop of a hat, even though he was a lawyer. He also would defend unpopular people if he thought they had a good case. So some people held that against him. I remember Senator Holland of Florida on the floor one time was talking about who would make a good Supreme Court justice. Joe and I were sitting together in the gallery, and Holland said, well, of course, I don't think you should ever condemn people for their legitimate views, but he said, if somebody like Joe Rao, I wouldn't want to see them on the Supreme Court. Joe probably was more brilliant than anybody that ever served.
Let's move on to the question of coalitions and how they develop. Arnold Aronson explained to me that the genesis of the coalition movement really was or centered on the struggle with Randolph for FEPC.
That is correct.
And that's when they all came together. There's a
It
national...
was called the Committee for Permanent FEPC.
Right.
And Mr. Randolph was at least the titular head. Like so many of those organizations, I don't remember whether they all got together in a room one day and decided, let's have this, but whatever it was, they did set up a committee for a permanent FEPC. But after the fight for an FEPC began to drag on, it was obvious we had to have a broader objective than that. And I don't know how the title Leadership Conference on Civil Rights got started, but that did become the vehicle which was doing what the Committee for Permanent FEPC and others were doing.
Roy and Arnold Ahrens started what became the Leadership Conference. Well, in other words, the civil rights mobilization.
Well, that's interesting because we were trying to figure out Walter's role in that the other day, and we were talking about this is not the other day, but a few months ago. My very best recollection, Walter was the first head of that. But somehow the records have gotten destroyed or misplaced or something. Anyway, we can't find something other than Arnold found some little scrap of paper somewhere, which he said seemed to substantiate the point that Walter was the first head of it.
The way he explained to me was this: he said that Roy worked with him in creating it, and then when Walter returned, Roy stepped aside in deference to Walter.
I don't think that's the way it was, and we'll probably never be able to resolve it. But my recollection is that it was decided that we would have a mobilization called a prayer pilgrimage in Washington, and there was a great to-do about keeping the communists out and that kind of thing, and just about everybody was involved in that. My recollection further is that was such a big success. At that time they had 17,000 people out, and that was thought to be a big crowd, which it was in those days. And my recollection is that at that point the question arose, who's going to be the head of it? And I thought it was agreed that Walter would be the head of it. But before it really got off the ground, Walter had this situation where he took a leave of absence, as you know.
Right.
And Roy stepped in his place, and for all practical purposes, became the head of the Leadership Conference. But no, he didn't. It was Randolph was the first head of it.
Randolph was the first.
Yes, that's right. Because you see, the stationery says the ex-chairman are Randolph, Roy, and myself. And I thought we ought to put Walter there somewhere, but we could never find the documentation of it, although my recollection is that he was.
What was your role at that time? Because
my role was what later became the legislative chairman.
Right.
Now, we didn't have that fancy title when we started off. I was doing the same things, but the title of legislative chairman came along later.
Now, the question of working with other groups in a coalition.
Right.
It evolved.
Right.
What were your impressions then of working with others in a cause like this? You're working. I view your relationship with Joe as sort of very symbolic of the coalition movement.
Well, actually, he was broader than Joe, and it was a wonderful experience in that I met some magnificent people to work with. For example, as Herman Edelsberg, who was the Anti-Defamation League, and succeeded by David Brody, who is still one of the people I work with. Then there was Father Higgins, George Higgins of the National Catholic Welfare Conference. There was Philip Murray, who was, of course, the head of the CIO in those days. Andy B. Miller, who was first in Congress and then later with the AFL CIO. We had all kinds of fraternal groups that we worked with. I can't remember whether Finley Wilson was still head of the Elks at that time. Might have been, but anyway, Hobson Reynolds was the one that we worked with mainly. And
in what way?
Well,
the fraternal, you're right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we try to get him to influence such votes as the Elks might have any influence with. I'm never sure what influence they had, but anyway, we asked them to work on things, and they did have connections with the Republicans. They didn't have so many with the Democrats.
Interestingly enough, most of the members of the coalition, of that early coalition, were Jewish groups.
No, I'm not sure whether that's correct. I would say the really effective people were labor people.
Oh, sorry, right. You're right.
They weren't Jewish. You had the steel workers, for example.
Okay.
There were two men in that, brothers, Irish Catholics, who were wonderful to work with. And then you had the, of course, the Brotherhood was in it, Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. The automobile workers were tremendous in it. You see, the labor groups really provided the infantry, so to speak, and the money. They were the people who had the troops, and they also had money with which to help finance some of these demonstrations and publications and that kind of thing. There was a man now dead whose name was Paul Sifton, Sifton. He was a very gifted writer, and virtually on loan to us from the automobile workers. Then there was Bill Oliver, who was active at that time in the automobile workers. You see, the automobile workers had kind of a couple of ships in there with R.J. Thomas and being replaced by Walter Reuther, but that dealt with internal union politics.
How was Reuther at that time, your relations with Reuther?
Very good. See, Reuther knew Gloucester Current better than he knew. Yes. All right.